Judge Andrew Palitano thought he could publicly humiliate and silence Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with a $2,000 contempt fine. But what happened next turned the courtroom into a battlefield, exposed his hidden financial ties, triggered federal investigations, and shattered his authority in front of the entire nation. The federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. was packed long before the hearing officially began. This was a Voting Rights Act hearing, and tensions across the country were already high. New voting laws had triggered protests, lawsuits, and non-stop cable news debates. Everyone in the room understood the stakes. What happened here would ripple far beyond this courtroom. At the center of it all sat Judge Andrew Palitano, elevated behind a massive wooden bench that made him physically and symbolically larger than everyone else in the room. At 75 years old, he carried himself like a man who had spent decades being listened to without interruption. Before becoming a federal judge, he had built a national profile as a Fox News legal analyst, known for sharp commentary and a hardline conservative interpretation of the Constitution. His reputation inside courtrooms was simple and intimidating. He controlled the room, and he expected absolute order. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, calm and motionless at the witness table. In front of her was a thick binder, packed with documents, charts, sworn statements, and internal communications. She wasn't new to this kind of pressure. Before entering Congress, she had spent years as a civil rights attorney, standing in courtrooms just like this one, fighting cases that most people were too afraid to touch. The tension in the room came from more than just personalities. This hearing was about alleged voter suppression, accusations that state officials were deliberately making it harder for minority communities to vote. Republicans were already framing the issue as federal overreach. Democrats were calling it a civil rights emergency. Outside the building, protesters gathered with signs, chanting slogans that echoed faintly through the courthouse walls. Inside, both political camps were watching every second, ready to spin whatever happened next. Before Crockett even opened her binder, Judge Palitano leaned forward slightly and cleared his throat. The sound cut through the room like a signal flare. His voice was firm, slow, and deliberately public. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, looking directly at her. "This is a federal courtroom, not a political stage. I expect your testimony to remain strictly factual and free of grandstanding." A ripple of quiet tension moved through the audience. It wasn't a neutral reminder of procedure. It sounded like a warning. When Jasmine Crockett finally took the microphone, the air in the courtroom tightened. She didn't smile. She didn't soften her tone. She flipped open her binder with a sharp snap and slid the first document forward. "Let's stop pretending this is complicated," she said, her voice steady but cutting. "People lost their right to vote because doors were literally shut in their faces." She pointed to the screen behind her. 47 polling locations closed in Harris County alone, 87% of them in majority-minority neighborhoods. That is not coincidence. That is design. A wave of murmurs rolled through the gallery. Reporters started typing faster. Crockett didn't pause. If this were happening in another country, we would call it election interference. But because it's happening here, suddenly everyone wants to call it policy. She moved to the next page and lifted a stack of printed emails. "These are internal communications obtained through federal records requests," she said, raising them slightly so the cameras could catch the header lines. "Time-stamped, authenticated, names included." Then she looked directly at Judge Palitano. Not opinions, not rumors, not activist talking points. Actual instructions from state officials coordinating which neighborhoods would lose polling locations first. Her voice hardened. They didn't say improve efficiency. They said shift resources away from high-density districts. That's code. Everyone in this room knows it. Several Republican members shifted uncomfortably. One leaned back, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. On the other side of the aisle, Democratic lawmakers leaned forward, eyes locked on Crockett. Palitano cut in sharply. "Congresswoman, you are drawing inflammatory conclusions. Stick to neutral facts." Crockett didn't even turn toward him right away. She kept her eyes on the screen and replied, "Neutral facts don't need protection, Your Honor. They speak for themselves." Then she turned and faced him. "What you're calling inflammatory is what happens when numbers expose behavior." The room went quiet. Even the court clerk froze mid-keystroke. Crockett flipped another page. "Now let's talk about the people who carried out these orders." She held up a signed affidavit. "This is a sworn statement from an election worker, not a politician, not an activist. Someone who was told to delay ballot deliveries and understaff polling sites in high turnout districts." She paused just long enough for the words to sink in. "And before anyone tries to dismiss this as hearsay, it's notarized, verified, and backed by time-stamped system logs." Palitano interrupted again, louder this time. "This hearing is not a platform for storytelling." Crockett snapped her binder shut halfway and finally locked eyes with him. "Storytelling?" she fired back. "What's a story is pretending these communities just accidentally lost access to the ballot. What's fiction is acting like this happened without coordination." Her voice sharpened. "I am presenting evidence. You keep trying to interrupt it. So I have to ask, are you protecting courtroom order or are you protecting the people who wrote these emails?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. Cameras zoomed in. Palitano stiffened in his chair. Crockett didn't back down. "If facts make this courtroom uncomfortable, that's not my problem. That's the consequence of telling the truth." She reopened the binder and pushed it closer to the edge of the table. "You can cut me off again," she said coldly. "You can call this political. You can pretend this is noise. But every interruption just makes it clear that someone in this room doesn't want these documents on the record." The tension hit a breaking point. Republicans whispered urgently among themselves. Democrats sat in stunned silence, eyes wide. The collision came fast and loud. Crockett leaned forward slightly and spoke with controlled force. "Facts are not disrespect," she said. "They don't insult anyone. They just expose what already exists." Judge Palitano's jaw tightened, and he raised his voice for the first time. "Congresswoman, you are walking a very thin line," he warned. "This is my courtroom, and I decide what is appropriate." Crockett didn't blink. "With respect, Your Honor," she replied, "your title doesn't give you ownership of reality." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Even seasoned reporters paused their typing, sensing the moment tipping from formal hearing to open confrontation. Crockett reached for her tablet and held it up slightly. "I request permission to submit digital exhibits," she said. "These include original metadata files, server logs, and time-stamped communications that cannot be altered in print form." The request was calm, professional, and completely standard in modern hearings. Palitano cut her off instantly. "Denied," he said flatly. "This court will not entertain digital theatrics." Crockett frowned, not in confusion, but in disbelief. "You're refusing to review authenticated evidence without even looking at it?" she asked. "You're blocking verification tools that exist specifically to prevent misinformation." Palitano leaned forward, voice rising. "I will not allow you to turn this courtroom into a technology demonstration." Cameras zoomed closer. Red recording lights reflected off the bench. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost physical. That was when Crockett crossed the line he never expected her to cross. She straightened in her chair and spoke slowly, clearly, and loud enough for every microphone to catch it. "If you refuse evidence before reviewing it, that's not courtroom management. That's selective hearing." Palitano slammed his hand lightly on the bench. "Watch your tone," he snapped. Crockett didn't back down. "My tone isn't the problem," she said. "Your neutrality is." The room froze. A few people in the gallery gasped. One reporter mouthed the words silently in shock. Crockett continued, eyes locked on the judge. "When a judge blocks evidence without examination, interrupts factual testimony, and protects one side from scrutiny, the public has a right to ask whether this bench is still neutral." Then the sound of the gavel came down like a gunshot. Judge Palitano stood slightly from his chair, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough," he snapped. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, you are out of order." He raised the gavel again, holding it in the air for emphasis. "I am holding you in contempt of this court and issuing a $1,000 fine for your continued disrespect." For a split second, nobody moved. The words didn't seem real. Then the shock hit the room all at once. Gasps spread across the gallery. Legal analysts in the media row exchanged stunned looks. A federal judge had just fined a sitting member of Congress on live camera. The echo of the gavel was still fading when Crockett slowly lowered her hands from the binder. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She didn't raise her voice. She simply sat there, silent, eyes locked on the bench. That silence was louder than any shout. Palitano straightened his robe and looked out over the room as if he had just restored order. For a brief moment, the balance of power tilted back in his favor. He had the authority. He had made his move. The courtroom was frozen, waiting for Crockett to react. But she didn't react the way he expected. Instead of anger, something else crossed her face. Crockett took a slow breath, then another. The tension stretched until it felt unbearable. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of her mouth lifted. It wasn't a smile of humor. It was the calm expression of someone who had just been handed exactly what they needed. Crockett's smile faded just as quickly as it appeared. She straightened in her chair, adjusted the microphone, and spoke with a calm that felt dangerous. "Your Honor," she said, "I accept your contempt citation." The room stirred in confusion. A few people nodded, assuming the fight was over. But Crockett wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "before this court moves forward, I need to place something on the record." Her tone was firm now, controlled, deliberate. "As a sitting member of Congress, I am protected under the speech or debate clause of the United States Constitution. That protection exists for a reason, to prevent exactly this kind of interference." She leaned forward slightly. "My testimony today concerns pending federal legislation and documented voting rights violations. That is legislative activity. That means this courtroom does not have the authority to punish me for it." You could feel the temperature in the room drop. Republican members started whispering to aides, fingers moving quickly across their phones. One staffer in the back row quietly stood up and stepped out of the room. Judge Palitano shifted in his chair for the first time since the hearing began. Crockett didn't slow down. "The Supreme Court has already ruled on this," she said, flipping to a marked page in her binder. "In Gravel v. United States, the court made it clear that members of Congress are immune from legal action for legislative acts, including testimony related to official duties." She looked directly at Palitano. "That ruling is not optional. It is binding precedent." Cameras zoomed in. The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of equipment. Palitano opened his mouth as if to interrupt, then hesitated. The hesitation was noticeable. Crockett saw it and pressed harder. "So when you fined me for presenting evidence tied to legislation," she said, "you didn't just discipline a witness. You crossed into constitutional territory." Her voice sharpened. "And that makes this contempt ruling legally questionable at best, and unconstitutional at worst." A murmur swept through the room. Democratic lawmakers sat motionless, absorbing every word. Republicans looked tense, some avoiding eye contact altogether. Judge Palitano wasn't in control of the conversation. He wasn't cutting her off. He wasn't raising his voice. He was listening. Crockett held the silence for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. "You tried to silence legislative testimony with judicial authority," she said quietly. "That's not order. That's overreach." Crockett didn't give the judge time to recover. She reached into her binder again, this time pulling out a printed transcript with bold markings across the page. "Your Honor," she said, holding it up slightly. Let's talk about something you said before you ever sat on this bench. The room shifted. Palitano's expression tightened. Crockett read directly from the page. 3 weeks ago, on national television, you said, quote, "The Protecting Voting Rights Act is dangerous federal overreach that will damage the integrity of American elections." End quote. The words landed heavy. Reporters' heads snapped up. Several cameras adjusted their focus immediately. She lowered the paper and looked straight at him. That wasn't taken out of context. That wasn't edited. That was your opinion, broadcast to millions of Americans. Then her tone sharpened. And today, you are presiding over a hearing about the very same legislation you publicly attacked. A low wave of whispers rolled through the courtroom. Palitano cleared his throat. My previous media commentary as a private citizen has no bearing on my current judicial role, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Crockett didn't let him finish building momentum. It absolutely does, she fired back. Judicial Code of Conduct, Canon 2. It requires judges to avoid not only actual bias, but even the appearance of impropriety. She leaned forward slightly. Publicly condemning legislation and then punishing testimony that supports it is not a good look, Your Honor. It's a red flag. Palitano shifted in his seat. His hand tightened around the edge of the bench. The silence in the room felt electric. Then Crockett delivered the question everyone knew was coming. So, I'll ask you directly, she said, slow and clear. Did you disclose this public opposition to the Voting Rights Act before agreeing to oversee this hearing? The room froze. Palitano opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced down at his notes, then back up. That's not relevant to today's proceedings, he said awkwardly. Crockett shook her head. It's not just relevant, she replied. It goes to the heart of whether this courtroom is being run fairly. Whispers erupted across the gallery. Republican aides leaned in close to each other, speaking urgently under their breath. Democratic members stared at the bench, waiting to see how Palitano would respond. Cameras zoomed tighter on his face, catching the tension in his jaw and the hesitation in his eyes. Crockett held her ground. When a judge brings personal media bias into a federal courtroom, she said, the public doesn't see justice. They see a conflict. The air felt heavy. The damage was done. Whether Palitano admitted it or not, the appearance of impropriety had been planted in front of everyone watching. Crockett took a slow breath, then reached into her briefcase and pulled out her tablet. The screen lit up, bright and impossible to ignore. Your Honor, she said, holding it up so the cameras could see. Now we move from opinion to money. The word landed hard. She tapped the screen once, and a financial disclosure form appeared behind her on the monitor. This document was filed under your name with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts, she continued. It shows active stock holdings in a law firm called Brennan & Associates. The room stirred. Crockett didn't stop. That firm has been paid over $2.3 million by the Republican National Committee in the past 2 years to challenge voting rights legislation in federal court. She zoomed in on the numbers. And according to this filing, you personally hold $847,000 in Brennan & Associates stock. A sharp wave of noise broke out. Someone in the gallery gasped out loud. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward like predators smelling blood. Palitano shot upright in his chair. That's false, he snapped. You're misrepresenting. Crockett cut him off without raising her voice. I'm not misrepresenting anything, she said coldly. These are your filings, your signature, your account numbers redacted but verified. She swiped again, revealing a flowchart. Here's the timeline, she continued. RNC payments to Brennan & Associates. Brennan & Associates filing lawsuits to block voting rights protections. And you, holding stock that increases in value every time that firm wins. The courtroom exploded. Republican members jumped to their feet shouting objections. Out of order, one yelled. This is a setup, another shouted. On the other side, Democrats stood up as well, demanding immediate recusal. "He can't preside over this. This is a conflict of interest." The media section turned into chaos, cameras zooming, reporters speaking rapidly into microphones, producers waving frantically from the back of the room. Crockett raised her voice just enough to cut through the noise. "This is not speculation," she said. "This is a documented financial relationship tied directly to the subject of this hearing." She turned toward Palitano. "You fined me for contempt while holding personal financial stakes connected to the outcome of this legislation." Her words were sharp and deliberate. "That's not just unethical. That's dangerous." The room fell into a stunned, broken silence. Palitano sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, his eyes locked on the screen behind her. Crockett didn't wait for the noise to fully die down. She stepped forward slightly, voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, based on the financial conflict now on the record, I formally move for your immediate recusal from this hearing." The courtroom snapped back into silence. "I also move that the contempt citation against me be dismissed as constitutionally invalid and ethically compromised." Every camera in the room locked onto the bench. Palitano stared down at his papers, then up at Crockett, then back down again. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The judge who had spent decades controlling courtrooms suddenly had nothing to say. He reached for the gavel, then hesitated. His hand hovered in the air for a second, trembling slightly, before dropping back to the bench. The symbol of his authority stayed untouched. Murmurs spread across the room, growing louder with every second of silence. Crockett remained standing, shoulders squared, eyes forward, not aggressive, not emotional, just unmovable. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One side calm and composed, the other frozen and unraveling. Finally, Palitano cleared his throat. "Court is in recess," he muttered, his voice low and strained. He didn't explain. He didn't rule on the motions. He didn't even look up. He stood abruptly, turned away from the courtroom, and walked through the side door behind the bench without another word. The heavy door slammed shut behind him. The bench, once towering with authority, now sat empty, silent, exposed. For a moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed toward the aisle, shouting questions. Lawmakers argued loudly across the table. Staffers scrambled to make phone calls. But at the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett remained standing at the witness table, calm and steady, hands resting lightly on her binder. Within hours, the fallout exploded across every major network. Headlines flashed non-stop. Judge fined Congresswoman, then got exposed live. Courtroom meltdown goes viral. Conflict of interest rocks federal bench. Clips of the confrontation flooded social media, racking up millions of views before nightfall. Democratic leaders held emergency press conferences demanding Palitano's impeachment and immediate suspension from active cases. The Judicial Ethics Committee announced a fast-track review, confirming they were opening a formal inquiry. Then a new detail leaked. An anonymous courthouse staffer revealed that an emergency ethics call had been held behind closed doors less than 30 minutes after recess was called. By evening, legal analysts confirmed the FBI had begun a preliminary inquiry into potential judicial misconduct. What started as one hearing had turned into a national firestorm. As the story spread, the narrative shifted. This was no longer just about a judge and a congresswoman. Crockett's confrontation became a symbol of something bigger: how money, politics, and influence quietly shaped the justice system. Advocacy groups mobilized overnight, launching new investigations into financial disclosures across multiple federal courts. Reports surfaced that other judges with similar investment ties were now under review. Then another shock hit. A former clerk from Palitano's chambers went public, backing Crockett's claims and describing internal pressure to avoid cases tied to voting rights disputes. Public trust debates erupted across talk shows and town halls. Americans weren't just asking what happened. They were asking how long it had been happening. By the next morning, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Just one day earlier, Palitano had entered that courtroom in full control, gavel in hand, confident in his authority. Now his bench sat empty, his reputation under investigation, his future uncertain. Outside the courthouse, Crockett faced reporters calmly. "Accountability doesn't belong to one party," she said, "and truth doesn't need permission to be heard." Then she turned, walked down the courthouse steps, and disappeared into the crowd. Inside, the courtroom lights dimmed over an empty bench, a silent reminder of what had happened. He tried to fine her into silence. Instead, he paid with his authority. If you want more real stories where power gets challenged and truth fights back, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs to see it, and stay with us, because the next confrontation is already unfolding.